And trust in the judicial branch of government hitting a record low. A new Gallup poll suggests that Americans do not have much confidence in federal courts. The poll shows that only about 47% of Americans trust the Supreme Court and federal court system. Now that's down 20 points from 67 points just 2 years ago. The all-time high, according to Gallup, was in 1999. The trust level then was 80%. And new developments in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, a new report says the Justice Department is urging the Supreme Court to stay out of its documents dispute with former President Trump. The DOJ wants the Supreme Court to reject the former president's request for the court to consider the case. The Trump team wants a special master appointed to the case to look through the documents before the investigation continues, but the Justice Department argues the High Court should let a previous court ruling stand. The decision allowed the DOJ to continue its investigation. Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School and author of The Price of Principle, Alan Dershowitz, joins me. Good evening, sir. And the response by the Department of Justice today, basically telling the Supreme Court to stay out of it, it's a routine response, an expected one, because they won in the appellate court, and of course they don't want it to go on. They don't want to have to argue it against. So you agree it's rather routine?
Rather routine. The only thing that would have been surprising is that they had challenged the appointment of the special master, which they had opposed below, but then they seemed to concede that that's okay as long as the investigation can continue. I suspect that the Supreme Court will agree with the Justice Department on this one and say, let's wait until we see what the investigation uncovers before we jump into this case.
All right, now let me turn to the Supreme Court. Historic low, 20% drop in 2 years as to the trust in the Supreme Court. I find that horrifying that this institution is so distrusted. Your thoughts?
Well, the only judge that all Americans like is Aaron Judge, the guy who just won the American League championship for hitting 62 home runs. You're going to see a continuing trend of the Supreme Court getting in the high 40s and low 50s. And all courts, because courts are now choosing sides. And if you begin to choose sides, whether you're senators or congressmen or president or the Supreme Court, half the country is going to be in favor of you and half the country is going to be against you. The Supreme Court has basically begun to lose its credibility. It's been happening over a period of time as a neutral, objective, nonpartisan decider of what the Constitution means and what the law says. And so I think we're going to continue to see around 50%, not only for the Supreme Court, but for other courts. And that is a tragedy because generally the Supreme Court has been highly approved of by the average citizen because usually it doesn't affect the average citizen. It just decides cases. But when it decides abortion cases and gun control cases and cases that really people care about, then they're going to give poll results that are consistent with what they approve.
But it's supposed to be apolitical, and the difference in the court, the differences that you see should be sort of according to ideology in terms of how do you interpret the Constitution. Is exact, precise words in the Constitution, or is it sort of a living instrument that sort of grows as or evolves as the country evolves? And that, you know, it's now been, and that was sort of, at least I always thought, is the way that you were supposed to view the Supreme Court, through that lens.
Well, it's both. The Constitution provides for certain things that are dead, to use Justice Scalia's term. You have to be 35, not 34 and a half to run for president. But when it talks about equal protection of the law, you can have a reasonable dispute. Justice Jackson, the newest justice, said yesterday that equal protection of the law in the 14th Amendment permits taking into account race because the 14th Amendment was designed to help free slaves and give them equal protection. Other justices say no.
Is that a political decision? I guess is that a political decision or a legal constitutional conclusion or
It's a legal constitutional decision that's influenced by ideology and by background. Justice Jackson obviously has a lot of experiences and she has strong feelings that race matters. Others on the court say the only way to achieve real equality is through colorblind equality, and that issue will be presented to the Supreme Court soon in the Harvard and University of North Carolina case, where the issue is whether or not race can be taken into account by both a public and a private university. And my prediction is the court will say no, that you can use economics, you can use other things, but race in and of itself can't be taken into account either for positive or negative reasons. Jackson will say it can be taken into account for positive reasons, but not negatives. And we'll see. The vote, I think, will be either 5-4 or 6-3 against Harvard.
Professor Dershowitz, thank you for joining me, sir. A lot to talk about as the court decides all these cases. Thank you, sir.